Hello all, welcome. This is Eric Fine here in Connecticut. This talk is sponsored by our group, the Yale Center for Environmental Communication here at the Yale School of the Environment. In our center, we focus on 4 areas. We conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behaviors. We teach students and train working professionals. We convene a global network of climate communication scholars and practitioners, and we inform and engage the public through journalism, including Yale Environment 360, focused on environmental reporting and analysis, and the exclusively climate-focused Yale Climate Connections, which engages many thousands of people every day and includes a short daily radio story that airs on more than 700 stations nationwide. As for the logistics for today, the chat is closed. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and be aware that you only see the question you asked. We are monitoring the questions, so be assured your question will be seen. We will make a recording of this conversation available on our website, and we'll send a link to everyone who registered. According to our research at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, 63% of US adults rarely or never hear their friends and family talk about climate change. Internationally, over 50% of people have never heard of climate change or know very little about it in the majority of countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. When we talk about climate, translate the conversation into other languages and reach new audiences on new platforms, we get more people from more backgrounds to understand that climate change is happening and human caused, and to understand what we need to do about it. That's exactly the direction we need to head. And that's where the folks, the panelists today are taking us. So thank you for the work you're doing. Can't wait to learn more. Today's talk will be moderated by Cynthia Norrie. Cynthia serves as the Deputy Digital Director for the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and supports the program's digital marketing and design efforts. Prior to working here, Norrie worked as the social media and analytics specialist at Yale's Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, and she has also worked as a designer and digital marketer for various tech companies and digital agencies, including BuzzFeed.
Thanks, Eric. We're honored to have 3 speakers with us today. First is Christie Drupman, otherwise known as Brown Girl Green. She's a speaker, consultant, media producer, and environmental educator working at the intersections between media, diversity, and environmentalism. Drupman has educated hundreds of thousands of people across the globe about modern-day environmental issues through speeches, media content, and workshops centered around environmental media and storytelling in cities across the US. She is also the co-founder of the Green Jobs Board, a climate tech startup bridging the equity and inclusion gap within the green economy through conversations, resources, and pathways to bring more diverse talent into the environmental field. Isaias Hernandez is a Gen Z environmental speaker with years of experience in intersectional environmental work, working with businesses, institutions, and organizations to amplify and empower their environmental missions. Hernandez is well known in his field under the social moniker Queer Brown Vegan, his independent media platform with a global audience of over 100,000 plus followers. He attended the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned his bachelor's in environmental science. Hernandez is a full-time content creator for Queer Brown Vegan, a public speaker, and a consultant for social impact orgs. Sofia Kiani is an Iranian-American activist and is the founder and executive director of Climate Cardinals, an international nonprofit with 9,000 volunteers in 40 plus countries, working to translate climate information into over 100 languages. She represents the US as the youngest member on the inaugural United Nations Youth Advisory Group on climate change. Kiani was previously a fellow with PBS NewsHour and has written for news outlets such as the Washington Post, MTV News, Cosmopolitan, and Teen Vogue. She has been named Vice Media's Youngest Human of the Year, a National Geographic Young Explorer, among Business Insider's Climate Action 30, and one of Teen Vogue's 21 Under 21, and a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree. So, Today, we're going to hear from each of our panelists about their work in the climate space, and we'll follow that up with a Q&A in the second half. Thank you to everyone attending who submitted questions. We probably won't get to all the questions, but I think we'll cover a lot of ground today. And if you have any additional questions as we go, please use the Q&A feature, and we'll sort through those as we go. So without further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Christie Drupman.
Hi, everyone. Okay, it told me I can share now. Perfect. Okay, amazing. Hi, everyone. So nice to meet you. My name is Christie Drupman. I am a Jewish and Filipina environmentalist as well as media creator. I'm the founder of Brown Girl Green online. I educate people all across the world about environmental issues, making climate education more accessible, entertaining, and inspiring people to take action. I studied at UC Berkeley, Society and Environment and Urban Planning. I was the class of 2017. And during that time, I got really involved with youth student activism and really caring about climate education. But I felt like I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me, who came from marginalized backgrounds, really leading the way in this conversation. And I felt like we needed more representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this space. And yet I wasn't seeing that in higher leadership levels in this field. And so what do I do? So I am the founder and creator of Brown Girl Green, which is a multimedia series. I produce podcasts, blogs, videos, lots of Instagram posts over the years. I've been doing this for over 5 years now, using social media as a way to be able to reach the masses and to be able to convert academic and kind of jargony, policy wonky information into actionable and entertaining bit-sized pieces of content to make it more digestible for the general public to understand these issues. And I'm the co-founder of the Green Jobs Board, which is a climate tech company focused on recruiting and getting people into climate jobs. I'll talk a little bit more about the journey of the Green Jobs Board later in this presentation, but I wear a lot of hats, from both being a content creator to now being an entrepreneur, public speaker, facilitator, and JEDI, or Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion consultant, consulting some of your top environmental organizations and companies on how they can address anti-racism. So many of you here probably know that every degree of warming matters. When people say a 1.5 degrees Celsius world versus a 2 degrees Celsius world, they don't realize that every 0.1 degree of warming is actually going to increase the magnitude of disaster. And I think why I'm bringing this up is because I think there's a lot of climate doom. There's a lot of, very valid climate doom, but there's definitely this very existential defeatist attitude that it's too late because we are locked into a 1.5 degree Celsius warmed world, which, yes, we are going to experience significant loss, but we still have time to prevent a 2 degree Celsius warmed world. And I think why I like to communicate that on the platform is to teach people that every degree of warming matters and that we do have the time and the action to be able to do something about this. And I think the general public can understand that a little bit more by understanding how climate change is going to impact the places they live and the places they care about. So the main problem that I see it is that the pace of environmental education is not on par with environmental degradation. As we can see, even though the climate crisis is here, it's present, it's impacting Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and folks in the global South right now, not somewhere off in the far off future, the media hasn't caught up with this story. These are some graphics. The one on the right is from Media Matters. And as you can see, the climate crisis has barely been covered or scratched the surface. And on the left, we see that even though there's been, more articles and information happening every year, we are not having it happen at the pace we need to. So we realize that we can't rely on these mainstream media institutions to actually cover climate at the rate that they need to be. And referencing Yale climate opinion maps, only one in four people hear about global warming on the news once a week, and only 1 in 2 understand that humans are causing the climate crisis. So we're seeing also that even though people might know this vague climate change is happening thing, they're not really connecting the dots that humans have a direct role to play. And with that being said, people think it's just inevitable. So that also keeps breeding this idea of this defeatist mindset of, well, humans can't do anything about it, but we're seeing that humans are the direct cause, and so they can be the direct solution, right? And the other problem that I want to address is that there's a dramatic lack of diversity in leadership and voices in the environmental storytelling space. These are some charts from an organization that I love called Green 2.0. I highly recommend people check them out. But it showed that they surveyed among the 40 green biggest nonprofits that only 20% of their staff identified as people of color, and only 21% of their senior staff identified as people of color. So we're seeing that we're concerned about how climate stories are being told, but yet not putting the resources or the funding or the platforms behind the communities being most impacted by these issues. And so I wanted to bring this up to say, I was starting to connect the dots that we have both a climate communications issue, period, and how we're reaching the public, but specifically we have a diversity and inclusion issue on who's actually telling those stories. And if we don't connect those dots, we're missing large swaths of the population who are most impacted by these issues and who need to be in this conversation. And so that's why I created Brown Girl Green, because I was very frustrated. I saw all of these gaps and it was all in my little brain. And I was like, I need to create my own thing in the world. I'm not going to wait for mainstream media to get it right. I'm not going to wait for academia to get it right. I'm going to just do the thing and build the table. And so, yeah, I created Brown Girl Green as a way to amplify the voices of young Black, Indigenous, and people of color, climate activists, people from all generations, honestly, especially people in the global South, who I felt whose voices were not being heard on these issues. Some ways that I've worked to connect the dots over the years, I've made podcasts, interviewing people on the front lines of the climate crisis. I have interviewed entrepreneurs to try to put their businesses at the forefront of people's minds. I've made my own lifestyle vlogs to talk about how I struggle with sustainability as a young person of color, and try to take policy topics and break it down to make it more digestible to the public. And in addition to Brown Girl Green, the Green Jobs Board was born. So Green Jobs Board was born out of Brown Girl Green, where I was posting all this content over the years. But I asked myself, what was one of the biggest barriers on why I couldn't figure out the climate space? And for me, it was, how could I actually build a career? And I remembered how difficult it was for me to find a job when I graduated university, even though I had a great CV, all these things. But there were still so many barriers to entry for me to figure out what I wanted to do. And so in 2021, I started posting on Brown Girl Green about green jobs. And I had no expectations for it. But basically, everyone online was like, oh my gosh, this is such an amazing resource. You have to turn this into something. And I was like, this is just an Instagram post. But then I started creating more content about it. And eventually someone was like, hey, I got hired through your Instagram post. And I was like, what? That's insane. And it got to the point where people were like, we want you to make it its own organization, all these things. So we launched it as an Instagram account about a year ago. And now it's become an actual company. And so it went from an Instagram post to become a company. We're a team of 6 young people of color. And as you can see on the right, we now have actually done events. We've actually done workshops. We're actually out in the world. So we took a thing on social media that we realized was a gap to getting more people of color in the room to build climate careers, and actually have now created a full organization and a movement to rethink what the green economy can look like in the future. And lastly, some things I've done with my platform that also translated into real life impacts. I'm sorry, I have the slide with Harvard on it, but I worked with Harvard on some climate communications work, training young people on climate communications. I'm now working with the Cal Academy of Sciences to build out some programming for content creation and science and STEM education across the state of California. And I've been invited to the White House several times to do on-the-ground journalism and reporting about climate policy to educate the general public on those things as well. So that's it for my little spiel, but would love for people to connect with me, Brown Girl Green, on social media. If you're looking for a green job or know people who want a green job, check out the Green Jobs Board. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Christy. Next to discuss their work is going to be Isaias Hernandez.
Ooh, and yeah, that's amazing, Christy. So glad. Fun fact, me and Christy actually went to the same university. So we've been really good friends since then. And so we've lived together and everything. But hi everyone, my name is Isaias Hernandez. As you may have known, I use the moniker queer brown vegan as like this like platform, and I really look to create impactful and equitable environmental education. Just some of this basic impact, of course, right? Like globally across all platforms, I can reach 150,000 plus. I think the important thing about impact, unfortunately, like in this society, everything is measured through numbers and data. So, you know, as a independent platform, I'm always having to present this to like funders or people who want to work with me. But you know, one of the things that I've been recognizing as an environmentalist is that what made me get into environmental education is that I grew up in poverty living in Los Angeles, and that really cured my inspiration to learn about my environmental city. And that kind of led me to understand about environmental science. And something that I learned in undergrad during this time is that, you know, obviously 88% of people globally believe that there is an urgent need to teach about climate issues, right? Even if you're not political in the climate discourse, just learning about the environment should be prioritized. And one thing that I figured out in my own work is that environmental nonprofits and institutions today really struggle to maintain this social media presence. And 91% of people report learning from climate issues from media, which is like journalism. And then a fourth of that now is from social media alone. That comes from Pearson's Global Learning Survey. I don't think it was noted on there, but it was conducted back in 2021 when they found out that, you know, social media does play a very huge role in that. And so one of the things that I recognize as an educational platform is that making engaging environmental education and working in the intersection between scientists and institutions helps kind of, you know, move the dial in terms of like the conversations and the materials in which people are learning, you know, teaming up with climate scientists and authors to promote their books, and also just to create opportunities online. Similar to Christie's like ideas, like I really had a hard time finding a career outside of graduation when I wanted to really use education, science, and creative work within the environmental sphere, but I didn't really get that. Instead, I got rejections from all environmental NGOs. So that was my reality back in 2018 on that end. And so this is a little bit more about what I do. But, you know, my work has evolved over the last few years. I think for myself, I really needed to understand like the ways in which people want to collaborate. And so this is actually a collaboration I did with the Solutions Journalism Network, which they have a really good solutions-based journalism that highlights this need for solutions, but realistic solutions that are not just based on wishful thinking, but they also really measure science that doesn't work. So meaning that, you know, what worked in this case and what didn't work. And as you can see here, like, you know, I use a lot of creative design to inspire these types of conversations. And a lot of my work is inspired from old academic core type of architecture, because I really believe that as a person that was an undergrad during Berkeley, I was really inspired by like all these like old scientific images, but also the ways in which I wish I could have learned, because I felt that academia a lot is rigid. And so within that, I kind of evolved my work, realizing that, you know, short form videos and infographics are really important. Like they still are really important, but I recognize that I wanted to continue to evolve my work. And so this new iteration of my evolution of work kind of looks into creating independent long form media series. And so I created the Teaching Climate Together series that basically paired up an educator, which is myself, and a scientific expert or a grassroots leader to go over climate terminology, or not really climate terminology, but about their work and the ways that it relates to our current issues today. And I think for myself, this kind of comes back to this idea that I had to really rethink about intergenerational collaborations and what that really meant to me. And for me, it meant to actually start building those relationships with people that were in academia, that their science or their work wasn't really being heard, and the ways in which I'm able to create that relationship together And realistically, this is just our first independent project that we produced back in end of January, I believe, or February, that just came out last week. And I will be honest, like, this was probably the first investment that I worked with one of my mentors, Ellen Kelsey, to fund this series. We had maybe like, I think 3 or 4 grand. And, the goal is to hopefully get to 10 grand, where we have like a full production crew and like, be able to like have higher quality and everything like that. But we recognize that, her work in climate doomism and evidence-based hope was something that I felt that wasn't really talked about in social media spaces. And so we created this video. It was like a 30 or 26 to 30-minute episode that went over like local climate solutions. It's on my YouTube. Obviously, it's not like, you could do it, but I only have like 1 minute left. So I just really recommend that you all just take some time to just look at the video whenever you want. Hi, everyone. It's Isaias Hernandez. Anyways, I'm not going to get into the video, but the impact that this video had actually is that now I'm talking to other institutions and other academic scholars to see how we can work together. And there's really opportunities for young people that really want to get into media and entertainment, because my goal essentially is to get a TV show and enter entertainment and media. And I really believe that there is hope that does exist there. And to me, that was showcased in this collaboration that I was able to do. It's really fun. There's a lot of funny moments in the video that you have to find, but that's on my YouTube channel. But anyways, with that being said, I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for having me. You can follow me at Career Brown Vegan, and contact me if you ever want to work together. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Isaias. So last but not least, I'll introduce Sofia Kiani.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. Hi, everyone. I'm Sofia Kiani, and I am a 21-year-old Iranian-American climate activist. I'm currently a junior at Stanford, where I'm studying science, technology, and society with a concentration in media and communications, specifically climate communications. And I really want to start with what drove me to take action and why I've been inspired to work on the issue of climate change. So, as I mentioned, I'm Iranian American. Both of my parents are from Iran. And so growing up, I would visit Iran every summer, and I was struck by how awful the air pollution there was. You can see that one of the headlines shows that in Iran, thousands of people are being hospitalized every single day because of the air pollution. And this was right on the heels of my 6th grade class about climate change, where I learned that the Middle East was really suffering on the front lines of the climate crisis, with temperatures there rising more than twice the global average. And so from a very young age, I became starkly aware to how pressing the issue of climate change was for really my community. And it drove me to start to volunteer with various different climate organizations when I was in high school. And I ended up going viral when I was 17 for staging a hunger strike on Capitol Hill to basically protest lack of climate action and also what I felt was pretty damaging climate rhetoric, given that I grew up in McLean, Virginia, which is in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And the big pivotal moment for me was in 2019, when we were able to galvanize over 6 million people to go out into the streets to strike for climate action. And this was with the support of an incredible youth climate activists like Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nakate, all of whom really helped to spark this movement through the use of tools like social media. This strike was on the front page of the New York Times. And in previous years, adult organizers had only really been able to galvanize a couple 100,000 people to go out into the streets to strike maximum. But it was once social media was leveraged, with young people really starting to use their voices to call truth to power, that we were able to see this tremendous shift really in the social landscape, where climate change was able to become an issue that was more mainstream. And that was a moment that really inspired me. And it also inspired me to kind of do reflection and to remember where my enthusiasm and my spark for climate action really came from and where it started. And that was back when I realized all of the issues that were happening in Iran. And specifically, I had found a study that read only 5% of Iranian students could properly explain the greenhouse gas effect. And I had gone to scour the internet to find resources to basically talk to my relatives about the issue of climate change. And I was pretty alarmed that I couldn't find anything available in Farsi, which is Iran's native language. And so I decided, because I loved to have contentious debates with my relatives, that I wanted to translate information with the help of my mom into Farsi so that I could talk to them about the issue of climate change. And so with this basically being the inspiration for me, I decided in my senior year of high school to start Climate Cardinals with the goal of translating climate resources into as many resources as possible, after realizing that even though 75% of the world doesn't speak English, 80% of scientific literature is only available in English, and that's very applicable when it comes to climate change, when especially the UN, which is pretty much the foremost authority for putting out the IPCC reports and the newest and most timely information about climate change, is pretty much only providing their climate resources available in the 6 UN languages that account for less than half of the world's speaking population. So I decided to start Climate Cardinals, and we actually were able to leverage social media to rapidly grow. On our first day, we went viral with a TikTok video that reached a couple 100,000 people, and we had over 1,000 people sign up to volunteer with us. And now over, I think it's like 3 years later, which sounds crazy to say, we've been able to grow to over 9,000 student volunteers across 40 countries with an average age of just 16. And we've been able to translate over 1 million words of climate resources into over 100 languages, really utilizing this power of grassroots mobilization and young people. And that is fundamentally what drives the desire behind all of my work, the fact that young people are the future and we are really the present. My generation, our generation, is going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change if action isn't taken. We're already experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis at a rate 3 times higher than our grandparents, is what I read in the Washington Post just a few months ago. And so it is, of course, an issue that is deeply personal to us. And I also think we are very uniquely positioned to be able to come up with solutions and come up with the dialogue that can actually get people's attention. Another statistic that I reference often, that I referenced in my TED Talk, was that just a few years ago, 40% of adults in the world had never heard about climate change. And I know the Yale Center for Climate Communications has done a lot more polling since then. And there's been studies now that say like between 70 to 80% of the US public believes in climate change. And clearly there has been an increase in climate literacy, but there still is a lot of work to be done to combat misinformation. And beyond just combating people who are climate deniers, I think there's a lot of work to be done around climate apathy and getting people who are apathetic towards the climate crisis to feel empowered, to feel like they have solutions and that they have actionable ways that they can work on this. And that kind of takes me to my work with the UN. So I served on the UN's Youth Advisory Group on climate change as the youngest advisor for 2.5 years. And I am now transitioning to a new UN role, which I will be announcing in the next 2 weeks, which I'm very excited about. But I think generally, I realized that there is a concrete need for young people to be involved in co-creating the solutions that are ultimately going to determine our future. And to me, the UN has been a really incredible vesicle to be able to basically connect with people at the highest levels of our democracy, people like the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as well as facilitating methods for me to be able to connect with people like John Kerry and people who have concrete influence over the decisions that ultimately are going to shape so much of our future. And so that would be really my rallying call. This is all about standing up for Gen Z, standing up for sustainability. 83% of Gen Zers are concerned about the planet's health. It's because of this increasing phenomenon of eco-anxiety, where I remember when I was 17 and I couldn't vote, and I felt like so much of the work I wanted to do was outside of my hands. And being able to take action, being able to work on the things I do every single day with Climate Cardinals and other organizations really helped me feel like I had a better sense of agency over this issue that I knew was going to really impact me and my friends. And I think that the biggest thing I also want to leave people with is that this is ultimately a journey of progress and not perfection. And so I want to inspire many more imperfect climate activists than I do people who feel like in order to be a climate activist, you need to be vegan, you need to give up flying. I really think that all of us are on our own journeys of progress, and that by showcasing the average and ordinary moments of life that we all go through, we can show people that anyone and everyone should be a climate activist. And hopefully we can inspire as many, specifically young people, to get involved in this work through whatever way they can. And a final thing that I'll say for any young people who are watching is I like to always say that any major can be a climate major. So you can be studying fashion, and you can also be looking at how can you make more sustainable textiles. You can be studying theater, and you can think about how can you make your theater sets more sustainable. All disciplines have a unique sustainability or climate skew. It's just a matter of really identifying where are you best positioned to make a unique impact. But thank you guys, and Christie and Isaias are awesome. So I'm really excited to share this space with them and have a great conversation.
Thank you, Sophia. And thank you again to all the panelists. That was amazing. And I think we're all plenty inspired to get into our Q&A and ask a lot of questions. I know we have a lot of questions in our Q&A, and we have a lot of questions that people sent in earlier. Just as an aside really quickly, I know a lot of people are requesting contact information for y'all. We will send that around after the event to anyone who's registered. So look out for that if you didn't catch it the first time around. So I would love to get into the questions. I think a good place to start is talking about the audiences that y'all are speaking to on digital. I know, Sophia, you just mentioned Gen Z specifically. A lot of Gen Z can't even vote yet, right? So driving action is a very broad thing, right? Because they can't vote, but there's plenty of other things they can do. But I know you're speaking to a lot of audiences other than Gen Z. So I would love to hear more about any notable audiences that you would like to talk about, and how not only that you engage them on a personal level, but you build community with them as well.
Yeah, I love this question. I would say I definitely do love to speak to the more Gen Z audience, because I always like to also say it's really hard to be something that you can't see. And I always was really inspired by seeing other young people using their platforms. And it honestly inspired me to say, you know, if this person is able to go and testify before Congress, or able to go and lead a march or a protest, why can't I do that? Of course I can do that. And so for me, it's really important to really emphasize this notion of accessibility, and to show other young people, if I was able to do this work literally just because of a TikTok video and because I had a passion and a dream, then you should be able to do the same thing as well. But I think in tandem with that, another thing that is an important thing for me to speak to is the idea of that statistic I referenced earlier, which is that 40% of adults in the world had never heard of climate change. It is a lot of older adults, older Americans, who are not as progressive on the issue. And it is very important to be speaking to those populations as well. And a large part of the work that Climate Cardinals does is translating resources from like UNICEF, the UNEP, into as many languages as possible. But then particularly, one of the statistics I found was that of the 10 countries that are worst impacted by climate change, 9 of them are a majority non-English speaking. And so, for example, UNICEF, the reports that they were putting out, they were talking about the disproportionate impact that climate change was having on like African countries and like indigenous communities. And yet the report was not available in any of the native languages of those areas. And so we did work to translate into those native languages, so the people that are actually being worst impacted by these disasters have access to the resources they need to really make sense of the disasters that are impacting their communities, and so that they can have actionable recommendations on how they can get involved and how they can actually voice their concern and be part of the solutions.
Right. So this kind of reminds me of something that Chrissy, you touched on a little bit, was how maybe the mainstream media, we can call it, talks about climate and talks about climate justice, and who they're speaking to and where they're speaking to them. I would love to hear any of your opinions on that, and how you've tried to remedy that problem specifically through your work.
Yeah, I would just say there's a lot of like echo chambers in general, like that have been created by the media. And I think in a weird way, like those of us who do have platforms, like we have our own little echo chambers in some ways, right? And so the question of us being able to reach and break through to like other communities that don't just like automatically agree with us. I feel like the only ways I've been able to do that is through cross collaboration with like media outlets that aren't necessarily environmentally related. Especially those in like the Asian Pacific Islander, or just like, focus on diversity, more like focused on like cultural groups, culture and tech and media. Some of those spaces, it's been really cool to try to like collaborate more with that than just like the same people that are just going to agree with me, because then it shows me where are the gaps in how I'm communicating things. Because even with my own family members, right? Like I've been doing this for such a long time, but there's still things where they're like, I don't fully understand what you're saying. And like that puts me in check, right? Where I'm like, if I can't even talk to my own family about this, like what am I really accomplishing? And so I've had to like figure out like how to reword things, how to reframe things, to think about accessibility. And I always say, if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, then maybe you need to refine your approach. But I think also breaking out of those echo chambers is really important as well. If we're going to like, we can't just criticize the mainstream media and then keep, also not think about our own strategies and how we're like breaking out of that too. So that's what I wanted to share.
Right. And I think too, Isaias, you mentioned briefly in your presentation about academia, and I know, not everybody here you're speaking to, I maybe not even half of the people that you're speaking to, probably not, don't have necessarily a background in academia. They're not maybe used to reading data in the way that academics are. They don't know how to read a research paper, right? So I think the way that you're using narratives and storytelling and design is really important. And that's kind of what you're saying a little bit too, Christy, right? Is like, how do we distill that information? So Isaias, how would you say you do that? I mean, what tactics do you use the most to bring data into something that's more palatable for your audience?
Yeah, I think right now with long form media content and getting more into production, like I'm learning how to negotiate contracts again, how to submit proposals, editing, directing, producing. Like I still am learning a lot from that end. But I think when it comes to the data, one thing that I will say I had the privilege of studying environmental science is that when I go into these interviews and building these relationships with these academic scientists and also grassroots leaders that, right now we're talking to, is that I have to really do my homework and read the data and read what they've been saying, because I can't just show up to an interview and be like, so like, what was the data that you were talking about? I really need to, as I'm talking to them and I'm trying to relate to them in some way, I usually use a story of like, I was going through this mental health crisis, and then I read on data that it's X amount of percent of people that are actually stressed out about the planet. Like these are, I think, in terms of like the long form content, that's more of I think about it. I think with the digital content and the infographic content, what I realized is that usually 5 or less in evidence is usually the key that holds people together, because the more data you put, they're just like disconnected. And so what I use a lot in the Solution Journalism Network collaboration is that we use painting pieces to relate to like a metaphorical example, and then going into the data, because I think people are easily able to relate to art and culture before getting into data. And I think that opens like an introduction for them to feel, I guess, disarmed and not guarded as much, as that they don't feel smart enough to talk about it. Because you don't need to be smart enough to talk about art. Everyone can talk about art and culture. Like it's so inclusive to a lot of people.
Yeah. So, and I think Christy, I've heard you talk a lot about storytelling, and I know you do a lot of that type of work as well. And that seems very in line, right? Of kind of starting with emotion and then starting to teach after you kind of hit that emotional button, right?
Yeah, I would say that like you have to just figure out how to make things approachable to people. I think sometimes people think just taking like the the climate doom route of like, oh my gosh, just wake up, like it's scary. It just doesn't work anymore. People are desensitized. People don't even want to get out of their beds anymore. You know what I mean? Like we're living in a time of multi-layered crises. There has to be hope. There has to be solutions-oriented discussions, because people don't want to just have people screaming in their faces, telling them that they're part of the problem, that they're the problem, and that, no one cares. I hate that stuff. Like, it's done. It's dead. Like, leave it. It's like, trash it. We don't need that kind of narrative anymore. I understand the fear climate scientists have. Of course, I don't have to wake up every day reading that data. I'm sure that that is a whole nother level of anxiety inducing feelings. But from my perspective as a climate communicator to the folks that might resonate with that kind of messaging, it just doesn't hit the general public that much anymore. You have to talk about the places people love, the things they care about, meet them where they're at on, like, what are they scared to lose? What do they cherish? What is sacred to them? I think then once you understand that, you're able to take that data and information and actually make it strategic, make it applicable. I know people have talked so much about rising, heat waves, right? That's mostly relevant if you're gonna teach people, hey, what should you do during a heat wave, right? Like, this is probably really miserable. Guess what? This is also a part of the fact that the infrastructure is not there to cool down your city. That's also because our city hasn't actually put together a good climate resilience plan. And then you can start bringing and connecting those dots together for people. But if you just tell them, climate change is happening, and then they are like, well, I don't really know how to feel about that, or what does that mean to me? If you're not able to connect the dots on that, people aren't going to really listen to you, from my experience.
Yeah, hope-based messaging. We love hope-based messaging. This is making me think of how you all articulate your ideas in your work. And I know that translation is a big thing for a lot of you in your work. And Sofia, I'd love for you to chat more about climate cardinals and the importance of that translation in your work, and how that impacts the way that people hear stories, or the way that you're telling those stories to different audiences, because it is complicated, right? You can't really just tell the same story to one giant audience.
Yeah, definitely. And I responded to a few questions in the chat, and I'd love to also take the opportunity to say it out loud, because I think a common question I am always asked is what about Google Translate, or why can't you just use methods like that? But the reality is that usually routine translation methods, like just using technology on their own, are not good enough to do climate translation specifically, because a lot of the key terminology of climate change, like the word climate change itself, translates into weather when you use Google Translate or tools like that, is what I would say firstly. Secondly, because we do a lot of our work with volunteer translators, we've basically implemented a tiered process where we also fundraise and then pay professional translators to do reviews for us. And specifically because we're doing a lot of translations into African and indigenous languages, we're actually able to pay people from those countries to do that work. So it's actually a really awesome self-sustaining system where we're getting people who really need funding to do their work funding. And that is also to say that I see a huge opportunity for technology to make an outsized impact on the world of the climate landscape. And that's a big thing. We've actually have been leveraging AI and machine learning assisted translation to do the work that Climate Cardinals is doing, and then augmenting it with human translators to review. And we have an exciting announcement that will be coming soon about the work we've been doing for the last few months, really leveraging that technology. And I think another thing that I've been working on in addition to my Climate Cardinals work, which I'm also very excited to be launching this summer, is also a tech platform where we're using tech to basically make it easier for young people to shop sustainable fashion solutions, because I saw that was a question that was in the chat. And I think it all ties back to this entire narrative of it's it's really easy for us to get caught in a game of like pointing fingers or starting to blame and shame consumers in a way that I think is very unproductive to what Christie was saying. Especially when the reality is we need to start looking at this through a system change lens, because the notion of the personal carbon footprint was invented really, or like it was a marketing tactic peddled by the oil and gas industry to make us feel like we're responsible and we're the ones to blame, when it really is these large oil and gas corporations that have been prioritizing growth and their profit over the planet, and they're the ones who are responsible and need to really be held accountable with progressive climate legislation, when we've seen that so many of our politicians are bought and paid for by the oil and gas industry, which is why they continually block climate legislation from going through. So the more that we can really advocate to people, go out, go get the vote out, like vote for climate progressive candidates, that to me is the most productive framing through which we can look at this issue and actually give people a tangible, actionable thing to do where they can actually be making the biggest difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I get to, we have a ton of questions in the chat. I want to make sure I get to some of these questions, but I'd love to give Isaias and Christie a chance to talk about accessibility with their work, if they have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would just say that I think the ways that I think about accessibility, it's been a journey. I think when I was first making content, I wasn't even thinking about simple things like colors or even closed captioning. I really had to be educated a lot by my friends who do have disabilities about, how to make my content more accessible from, that standpoint. And a lot of it was like very challenging and uncomfortable at first, where like, I was like, well, I don't know anything about how to make those things more accessible. And so I had to learn about color theory. I had to like study about captioning and accessibility and even like the text that you can put on graphic posts to talk about like what you're wearing and like, all these things. It's been really interesting to explore that with content. I know maybe that's all you meant by accessibility, but I really wanted to bring that up because I feel like people with disabilities are left out of this conversation a lot. And I had to learn a lot as a content creator on how to make sure to not leave those folks out of that. But then also with accessibility, I think that's a big thing behind the Green Jobs Board. I would say that I've been to every climate jobs website you can think of, including, the big ones of LinkedIn and Indeed. And, I would say that's the definition of inaccessibility, where you have all this pool of information. But again, to actually think about how do you actually make it a conversation? How do you actually get people to know, okay, I have all these jobs. What do I do with that information? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to pull all of that information together easily on Green Jobs Board, making it a conversation, providing people with really interesting information through. We have a series called Job Notes where we give people advice on what do you do in an interview? How do you deal with a microaggression in the workplace? And then our newsletters, we actually are launching 4 different editorial newsletters that are going to hit different topics, from just like giving people general job resources to actually giving them targeted types of jobs that they could find, and jobs by sector, jobs by, location, things like that. And so, yeah, we basically, what I want to say about that is like, we had to address every accessibility concern that currently exists as a gap in the green employment space. And we're trying to make a platform that is basically trying to address all of that. And so accessibility is like constantly top of mind. And I think it's a constant, I guess you could say, iterative process, because I think what's accessible to one community might not be accessible to another. And I think you have to like decide as a content creator or someone who makes platforms like this online, how you're always working to do better on that. So yeah.
And really quick before I move on, Christie, and this is maybe too broad of a question to ask, but I'll try to ask it. For people who are trying to hire new, fresh talent as climate communicators, but are having trouble finding people, I mean, obviously there's people out there, right? Do you have advice for them? Either, I mean, of course, look at Green Jobs Board because there's plenty of, jobs and opportunities there, but as far as looking and what they're asking for and the kind of questions they're asking applicants, I mean, is there anything that you see over and over that you're just like, that's not great, like don't do that, or you should do more of this?
Totally. I mean, we just have to start with salary transparency. I mean, the bar is at the floor, to be honest with you. But I would say that like even telling people if something is unpaid or not, or what the actual hours are going to be and what the salary is, put that information on your posting. I would say the other piece is like being able to explain to people like what actually this job is going to look like, and putting that more detailed in the description of like day-to-day work, and just like explaining to people like this is what will be expected of you. I feel like a lot of companies, organizations leave their job descriptions very vague, and then someone will go into the job not knowing that that was what was actually expected of them. So I think it's better whether you do in the interview process or even in the general posting, is to really be clear about like what would the day-to-day look like, what are some of the expectations and the skill sets, and also to be clear that like if it's not an entry level job, if you're expecting 5+ years of a master's degree, like actually scale your jobs correctly based on experience, because that really creates a lot of barriers to entry for people who might not even have a master's. And maybe your job does require a master's, or you would like that, that's fair. But I would say also look at a holistic perspective of a person's experiences, not just if they have a master's or not, because I know some people that have such amazing field experience or have been entrepreneurs, run their own businesses. And just because they're a younger person and didn't have a master's, they're seen as less than just because they don't have that. I think that's ridiculous. So we need to like have more holistic evaluations of people's experiences, especially people without degrees, because most of the time those people come from marginalized backgrounds, and a lot of people can't even afford a higher education. So there needs to be just more holistic discussions about things like that, as well as, last point is skilling people up, creating training programs, curriculums. I hate the word pipeline, but like fellowships, programs that can actually funnel people from marginalized backgrounds into environmental careers. We see this in STEM education, that's emerging, but what about for climate scientists? What about for conservation field work? We're not seeing those kind of programs be that emergent, or if you want to be in that, it's such a gate-kept thing where it has to be a person knows a person. We need to break that out. Institutions need to create the infrastructure and the funding to make sure people of color are at the forefront of their budgeting plans. That's it. Thank you.
100%. I hope everyone on here is listening to all of that. Lots of actionable items there. So one thing I'm seeing a lot in the questions is this idea that people who are doing digital comms work generally are having a problem effectively communicating internally how and externally how integral climate justice is to the overall climate movement, and that without climate justice, if the overall climate movement is almost null, right? And that some of maybe like the more old school climate people don't quite understand that yet, or almost think of it as like an add-on or an extra. I mean, is that something that you've seen? And if you have seen it, how do you combat that, or how do you communicate that that's not the case? And I would love to hear from any three of you on this, because I think that this applies to all of you.
I'll just go quickly. I think when we need traditional, I mean, I guess the dominant environmental movement, so like the one that's popularized in media. So I think on my end, I think the issues with obviously this is the nuance with social media is that I think we still center whiteness in the environmental movement. So this idea of environmentalism, we think about Jane Goodall, David Attenborough, like Greta, they're all amazing, right? I'm not trying to hate on them, right, for what they've done. They've done great contributions to their environmental work. But I think a lot of people in the United States, and specifically in the US, because I grew up here in the US, is that we tend to consume media that makes us comfortable. So we see white people as experts. And so the ideas of anti-racism doesn't really get to the cross of climate justice, because I think it's easy for any of my white friends to say, yes, I'm pro Black Lives Matter. But then I ask them, how are you deconstructing your whiteness in the ways that you navigate in society? That's when they become uncomfortable and they feel like, well, I donate, and they become defensive. So I think on my end, what I really try to always recognize is that if you are not comfortable talking about racism and like white supremacy, how are you going to get to climate justice? Because the systems that we're currently entrenched in is built right on chattel slavery, like colonialism, like all of these other effects that have marginalized and hurt communities of color. And so I think on my end, like to add on to this idea of like, how do we ensure that climate justice is centered? It's just going back and rethinking the ways in which who is being centered in these movements. But again, challenging the dominant movement is always pushed back with, oh, you're just a hater. You're hating on this person. So I think on my end, I just really try to be honest of like, I'm just centering anti-racism in my work. If someone doesn't want to do that in their work, I mean, this is why we have the issue with social media influencers too, where we all seen it too. It's like all of us three. It's like white influencers have larger platforms and they grow large followings. And for influencers of color in the environmental space, it's like we talk about these issues and our content literally gets shadow banned or algorithmic biases that we don't know how to continue to push forward through that. So I think more disconnection from social media and more of those conversations implemented in real life.
So we have 4 more minutes. I have one more question I think we could probably fit in here. And I got this question a few times, so I want to make sure that I answer it. And I think it's really important given the context. How can institutions and bigger organizations, and by institutions, I include higher education and academia as well, how can they support the type of work that you're doing? Because I know that it can seem like there is quite a big gap sometimes, right, between where you're at and where they're at. And maybe, I hate to say this word, but bigger organizations have a lot of red tape sometimes, and maybe a little bureaucracy, and you are all a little more nimble, right? Because you have a little bit more of that startup culture because you're doing it yourself. So how can they best serve you, and how can you work together more effectively?
Yeah, I would just say that definitely view us as experts. I think other campuses have brought, me and Isaias, for example, onto their campus to do workshops, to actually work with faculty, to think through like larger programs. Something that we were working on last year, that's still, an open conversation, was working with some public health researchers to figure out how they could actually put a line item into their budgets for their grants for content communicators, so like for science communicators, and figuring out like how could people who do write these grants and have the experience for that be able to actually like get some budget to like support us as on the ground experts to support their bigger campaigns. I think that's one tangible thing that people in academia could like help us out with, is if like you wanted to work with us on something, that would be great. Another program I've experimented with is actually working with academics who have helped write some of my scripts. So they've actually done the research and helped me like actually put together my scripts for some of my videos. So doing some of that pro bono work, if you want your paper or your research to be out in the world, helping to do the legwork and support content creators, because we also want to, have good informed, well-researched content, but we don't have the capacity for that or the budget to hire teams to do that. So that's definitely a thing I could see. I'd say also getting us like access to resources to funding and philanthropy or other sorts of grants, because a lot of us are independently funded. I have never been able to accept any philanthropic funding. So, I mean, any connections to things like that all help those of us that create our own stuff and are dependent on programs like that for long-term sustainability of our work.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christie. It looks like we are about at time. So unless anyone else has any additions to that, I'm going to hand it back over to Eric. But thank you all so much. This was very illuminating and just fantastic. And I very much enjoyed speaking with you all. Oh, you're on mute, I think, Eric.
Thank you, Cynthia, for moderating the conversation. Christie, Isaias, Sophia, for all your thoughtful insights. We'll send a follow-up email after this event with the recording, links, and how to sign up to learn about our future webinars. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Have a nice weekend.